Few questions are as important, or as difficult, as the question that animates Robert Sapolsky's Behave. Why do human beings do what they do? Why does one person commit an act of violence while another offers compassion? Why do people become tribal, cruel, forgiving, generous, impulsive, heroic, vindictive, cooperative, or self-destructive? For centuries, these questions were often answered with moral labels, philosophical theories, religious ideas, or simple judgments about character. Behave does something far more ambitious. It gathers neuroscience, endocrinology, genetics, psychology, primatology, anthropology, developmental science, and moral philosophy into a single vast attempt to explain human behavior in all its complexity. Sapolsky's central claim is that if we want to understand an action, we must stop looking for one cause. Behavior is never the product of a single thing. It is the endpoint of a chain stretching backward across multiple timescales. What happened 1 second before the behavior? What happened minutes before? What hormones were present hours earlier? What experiences shaped the brain years earlier? What kind of environment structured childhood? What genes were inherited? What culture taught the rules of belonging? What evolutionary history prepared the organism for certain kinds of response? Behave insists that all of these matter. It is a book of extraordinary scope, but its emotional force comes from one simple idea. People are not detached choosing machines. They are history-bearing organisms. Every act contains layers. And if we want to understand human goodness and human horror honestly, we must be willing to travel through those layers without rushing towards simplification. One of the most distinctive features of Behave is the way Sapolsky organizes the question of why behavior happens. Rather than beginning with abstract claims about human nature, he starts with the act itself and then moves backward. What was happening in the brain a second before the action? What sensory information and neural firing patterns were present? Then he steps back further. What hormonal conditions were in place minutes or hours before? What experiences in the preceding days may have altered mood, attention, or reactivity? What events in adolescence and childhood helped construct the person's patterns of emotion, attachment, and self-control? What prenatal factors shaped the developing nervous system? What genes were involved? What cultural forces taught the person how to interpret status, group membership, loyalty, danger, or fairness? And what evolutionary history made certain tendencies possible in the first place? This structure is more than a clever organizing device. It is the book's deepest argument. No explanation is complete by itself. A brain event matters, but the brain that produced it was shaped by stress, memory, development, and circumstance. A hormone matters, but only in context. A gene matters, but only through interaction. Culture matters, but it works through bodies and minds that have biological histories. Sapolsky wants readers to feel the inadequacy of single-cause thinking. If we say a person acted this way because of aggression, or hormones, or childhood trauma, or ideology, or tribal loyalty, we have only touched one layer. Human behavior is multi-determined. That is the book's guiding truth. Sapolsky devotes significant attention to what is happening in the brain immediately before a behavior occurs. This is where action becomes concrete. Neural circuits involving threat detection, reward expectation, memory, impulse control, habit, planning, and emotional salience interact in real time. Certain brain regions appear repeatedly in the story, not as isolated switches, but as participants in a dynamic network. The amygdala helps detect and assign importance to threat and emotion. The prefrontal cortex contributes to judgment, inhibition, planning, and regulation. Reward-related systems respond to anticipation and motivation. But Sapolsky is careful to resist the simplified popular style of neuroscience that suggests one brain region equals one psychological trait. The brain is not a clean map of separate moral modules. It is a constantly interacting system. Fear can alter reasoning. Memory can intensify emotion. Impulses can outrun inhibition. Reflection can sometimes redirect a reactive urge and sometimes fail to do so. This level matters because behavior feels immediate. It seems to happen in a moment. Yet even that moment is already the expression of prior construction. The brain in the final second before an action is carrying the imprint of past stress, learned patterns, culture, trauma, and biology. So while the neural level is crucial, it is never sufficient alone. It tells us what mechanism is firing, but not how that mechanism came to be shaped the way it is. One of Sapolsky's great strengths is his ability to explain biology without turning it into caricature. Hormones and neurochemicals matter enormously in the shaping of behavior, but Behave repeatedly warns against crude explanations. Testosterone is not simply the aggression hormone. Oxytocin is not simply the love hormone. Dopamine is not just pleasure. Cortisol is not just stress. These substances alter tendencies, salience, motivation, and interpretation within particular contexts. Testosterone may enhance status seeking, which can mean aggression in one environment and prestige building or generous display in another. Oxytocin may deepen attachment and trust within a group while simultaneously increasing suspicion of outsiders. Dopamine helps organize wanting, anticipation, and reward learning, not merely enjoyment. Cortisol helps mobilize the body for challenge, but chronic elevations can wear down health and alter cognition. Sapolsky's broader lesson is that biology is always relational. Hormones do not manufacture behavior from nowhere. They amplify, modulate, and bias responses already being shaped by social setting, past experience, and current cues. This is crucial because popular biological explanations often sound deterministic while actually being shallow. Behave makes biology richer and more complicated. It teaches readers to ask not only whether a chemical mattered, but in what setting, toward what target, under what history, and in interaction with what other forces. Stress is one of the recurring concerns throughout Behave, and for good reason. Sapolsky has spent much of his career studying how stress affects the body and brain, and in this book that expertise becomes part of a broader theory of behavior. Acute stress can be adaptive. It prepares an organism to respond quickly to challenge. But chronic stress is different. When the body remains on alert for long periods, the consequences spread across mood, health, cognition, attention, sleep, immunity, and judgment. A chronically stressed nervous system does not perceive the world the same way a settled one does. It becomes more reactive, more vigilant, sometimes more impulsive, sometimes more emotionally narrowed. This matters morally and socially because it means behavior cannot be understood apart from the physiological burden people carry. Poverty, instability, trauma, insecurity, discrimination, and chronic threat are not just external hardships. They enter the body. They become biology. They alter how easy or difficult it is to remain patient, generous, reflective, and regulated. Sapolsky does not use this to excuse all behavior, but to deepen explanation. If a society wants better behavior, it cannot ignore the conditions that dysregulate millions of nervous systems. Stress is not background. It is one of the engines through which structure becomes action. Another essential layer in Behave is development. Adult behavior is not born fully formed in the present moment. It is built over time, especially through childhood and adolescence. Sapolsky shows how early experiences shape stress responses, attachment patterns, emotional regulation, trust, impulse control, and sensitivity to reward or threat. A stable, nurturing environment can support the development of resilience and regulation. A chaotic, neglectful, or traumatic one can do the opposite, sensitizing the individual to danger, unpredictability, or emotional instability. Adolescence adds another important phase as the brain systems for reward, emotion, and control mature unevenly. This helps explain why adolescence can be a period of risk, volatility, and identity formation. But Sapolsky goes even earlier than childhood. He examines prenatal influences as well, showing that the environment in the womb can affect later stress physiology and development. This is one of the most humane dimensions of the book. It insists that human beings arrive in adulthood carrying biological consequences of environments they did not choose. The nervous system has a biography. To see only the adult act while ignoring that biography is to misunderstand what we are looking at. Sapolsky devotes careful attention to genes, but one of his most consistent themes is that genes are not destiny in the simplistic sense people often imagine. Genes matter deeply. They affect how brains develop, how hormones are regulated, how stress systems respond, and how organisms differ in temperament, vulnerability, and sensitivity. But genes do not operate as solitary commands. Their effects depend on timing, environment, regulation, developmental context, and interaction with countless other biological processes. This is one reason behavior resists deterministic storytelling. To say that a trait or tendency has a genetic component is not to say it is fixed, inevitable, or morally decisive. Genes help create a range of possibilities and predispositions. Experience then shapes how those possibilities unfold. Sapolsky repeatedly pushes readers away from the fantasy that explanation becomes cleaner once genes are involved. In reality, explanation becomes more intricate. A gene may matter only under certain environmental stressors. Another may affect susceptibility but not direct expression. Biology here is probabilistic and relational, not mechanical in the crude popular sense. The practical lesson is intellectual humility. When behavior is explained through genetics alone, we are almost certainly hearing an incomplete story. Behave also reaches into evolutionary history, asking what the human species has inherited from the long arc of adaptation. Sapolsky treats evolution seriously, but again without simplification. Evolution can help explain why humans possess capacities for aggression, tribalism, status competition, bonding, cooperation, empathy, punishment, and reciprocal fairness. These tendencies did not appear from nowhere. They are part of the species toolkit. But evolution explains possibility, not inevitability. Human beings did not evolve for one single social mode. They evolved with multiple potentials that can be activated under different conditions. This is one of the book's most important balancing acts. It rejects naive optimism about human goodness, as well as crude biological pessimism. We are capable of extraordinary cruelty, and this capacity is real. But we are also capable of astonishing cooperation and sacrifice. Both are human. Evolution has left us with a nervous system prepared for rivalry and alliance, exclusion and inclusion, fear and care. Which side becomes dominant depends on the intervening layers of development, culture, context, and structure. This evolutionary view broadens the scope of the book while also reinforcing its central message. There is no single human nature in the narrow sense. There is a repertoire, and history determines how that repertoire is performed. One of the most compelling parts of Behave explores how readily humans divide the world into us and them. Group identity shapes perception with astonishing speed and power. The boundaries of who counts as familiar, trustworthy, deserving, threatening, or fully human are influenced by biology, learning, culture, and context. Sapolsky shows that in-group and out-group distinctions affect empathy, punishment, fear, generosity, and moral reasoning. The same person may show tenderness toward one group and indifference or hostility toward another. This is one of the most unsettling truths in the book because it reveals how contingent moral concern can be. Yet Sapolsky is not fatalistic here. He emphasizes that group boundaries are flexible. What counts as us can expand or contract depending on framing, institutions, narratives, shared goals, and repeated contact. This makes the topic politically and morally significant. If tribalism were fixed, there would be little hope. But if the nervous system is highly responsive to cues about belonging, then better cultures and structures can widen the circle of concern. This is one of the book's most important hopeful insights. Humans are biased toward group thinking, but the definition of the group is not biologically frozen. The moral imagination can be taught, encouraged, and scaffolded. The question is whether societies do that work or intensify division instead. Sapolsky does not look away from the darkest parts of human behavior. Behave spends significant time on aggression, cruelty, war, punishment, torture, and genocide. The point is not sensationalism. It is to understand how ordinary organisms become capable of extraordinary brutality. Here again, no single explanation is allowed to dominate. Violence may involve hormones, threat perception, ideology, obedience, stress, dehumanization, social reward, historical grievance, group identity, status competition, and learned narratives. One of the book's most disturbing lessons is that horrific behavior does not always arise from obvious monsters who stand outside normal human psychology. Under certain conditions, ordinary mechanisms can be recruited into catastrophic outcomes. Obedience, conformity, fear, tribal loyalty, disgust, and moral certainty can all become ingredients in cruelty. This is morally sobering because it weakens the comfort of thinking that evil belongs only to a separate species of person. Sapolsky's broader point is that if we want to reduce violence, we must understand the conditions that make it easier, not simply denounce it after the fact. Condemnation alone explains little. Prevention requires causation. For all its seriousness about violence and tribalism, Behave is equally committed to understanding humanity at its best. Sapolsky explores empathy, cooperation, moral courage, generosity, and acts of astonishing decency. These two have biological and developmental roots. Compassion is not supernatural. It depends on circuits of social understanding, on emotional resonance, on the ability to imagine another's experience, on regulation that prevents fear or disgust from overwhelming concern, and on cultural narratives that teach who deserves care. One of the most moving implications of the book is that our finest moral acts are no less real for being embodied. In fact, understanding the mechanisms of empathy can make it easier to protect and extend them. If stress narrows compassion, then reducing stress matters morally. If group boundaries restrict empathy, then widening those boundaries matters. If certain institutions cultivate dehumanization while others cultivate contact and mutual recognition, then institutional design matters profoundly. Sapolsky's account of human goodness is therefore not sentimental. It is structurally serious. Better behavior is not a mysterious gift. It is something made more likely by particular kinds of brains, histories, environments, and social worlds. Running beneath the scientific detail of behave is a large philosophical challenge. If every behavior is caused by layers of factors reaching backward through biology, development, environment, and history, then what becomes of simple moral judgment? What becomes of blame? What becomes of the idea that a person could have acted otherwise in some clean, uncaused sense? Sapolsky does not present this as an abstract puzzle detached from life. It has consequences for how we punish, forgive, fear, and structure justice. The more fully we understand causation, the harder it becomes to hold on to crude notions of isolated personal authorship. This does not mean behavior has no consequences or that dangerous people should simply be released into the world. It means the rationale for response may need to shift. Instead of metaphysical blame, the focus may move toward protection, prevention, rehabilitation, and the reduction of future harm. Sapolsky's position is unsettling because it challenges emotionally satisfying ideas about retribution. But it is also ethically expansive. A deep understanding of causation may produce less hatred, less self-righteousness, and more serious concern with the conditions that generate behavior in the first place. From this perspective, Behave becomes not just a scientific book, but a moral and political one. If behavior has causes, then societies cannot be content with simply labeling people good or bad and stopping there. Questions of justice become more complex. What does punishment mean if action emerges from a causal chain the individual did not author alone? How should legal systems respond to danger while also recognizing constraint? How should societies think about crime when childhood adversity, chronic stress, brain injury, and deprivation are part of the causal story? Sapolsky does not claim to solve every one of these issues neatly, but he pushes readers toward a major shift. Scientific understanding should not remain in the laboratory. It should reshape how we think about responsibility, prevention, and humane institutions. The practical force of this argument is enormous. It suggests that reducing harmful behavior requires far more than moral exhortation. It requires early intervention, reduction of trauma, support for development, and systems that do not keep manufacturing damaged lives. Taken as a whole, Behave offers a vision of human nature that is neither optimistic in the easy sense nor cynical in the fashionable sense. It rejects the idea that humans are naturally noble and corrupted only by circumstance. It also rejects the idea that humans are naturally savage and merely restrained by civilization. Sapolsky's view is more difficult. Human beings contain capacities for brutality and compassion, tribal exclusion and universal concern, selfishness and sacrifice. These capacities are real, embodied, and ancient. Which one emerges depends on layers of influence ranging from the molecular to the historical. This is why the book feels at once humbling and empowering. It humbles simplistic moral certainty. But it also suggests that better outcomes are possible because behavior is shaped. If behavior is shaped, then changing conditions matters. Environments matter. Institutions matter. Childhoods matter. Narratives matter. Biology matters. This is not a picture of a species trapped in one fate. It is a picture of a species whose possibilities are channeled by the worlds it builds. If we gather the book's central lessons into a concise form, they would sound something like this. First, no human action can be understood through a single cause. Second, the brain and body are shaped by history, development, stress, and environment long before a behavior occurs. Third, biology matters profoundly, but it always operates in context. Fourth, early life conditions and chronic adversity leave lasting marks on behavior. Fifth, group identity powerfully shapes empathy and cruelty, but group boundaries are more flexible than people often assume. Sixth, humans are capable of both terrible violence and profound compassion. Seventh, a serious understanding of behavior complicates simplistic ideas of blame and punishment. And finally, if we want better behavior, we must stop asking only how to judge people and start asking how to build conditions in which their better possibilities are more likely to flourish. These lessons are not merely scientific. They are moral in the deepest sense because they change how we think about what people owe one another. The enduring power of Behave lies in the way it joins science with moral seriousness. Robert Sapolsky does not use biology to flatten human experience into mechanism. He uses it to deepen our understanding of why behavior is so hard, so layered, so tragic, and so full of possibility. The more carefully he explains causation, the more difficult it becomes to indulge in shallow judgment. This does not make cruelty less cruel or suffering less real. It makes them more intelligible. And in that intelligibility there is a different kind of humanism, one based not on idealizing people, but on understanding them more honestly. Behave asks readers to give up the comfort of simple stories. It asks them to see that every act emerges from a system stretching backward through time and outward into society. That is an intellectually demanding request, but it is also an ethical one. Because if we truly understand why people behave as they do, we may become less eager to condemn, more eager to prevent harm, and more determined to create a world in which the biology of compassion has a better chance than the biology of fear. That may be the deepest lesson of the book. Explanation, at its best, does not reduce humanity. It enlarges it.